The dust tasted of judgment. It was a fine, pale powder that clung to the inside of her throat, settled in the folds of her ragged dress, and coated her bare feet, turning them the color of old bone. She stood lashed to a hitching post in the center of what passed for a town square, a place that was little more than a sun-scalded wound in the earth. The rope was coarse, biting into the skin of her wrists. She did not pull against it. She had learned long ago that fighting only made the ropes tighter. She kept her eyes fixed on a loose board in the facing of the general store. It was a splintered gray line against a sun-bleached wall. It was a thing that did not look back, a thing that did not murmur or spit or laugh. The sounds of the townspeople were a low hum around her, like flies buzzing over something left too long in the heat. Their curiosity had burned out hours ago, leaving behind the dull embers of contempt. She was a stray, a piece of unclaimed baggage left on the world's doorstep, and they were tired of looking at her. Her hair, a tangled mat of brown and dust, hung across her face, a curtain she did not dare part. Through the strands she saw boots, scuffed, worn, cracked leather boots that stopped and stared. She heard the wet sound of a man spitting tobacco juice near her feet. The brown glob steamed for a moment on the hot ground before the dust drank it. A man with a voice like rocks grinding together, the one who had tied her here, bellowed for the third time that day. He called her cargo, a debt paid, a problem someone else could have for the price of a drink. No one moved. No one wanted this kind of trouble. She was an object, passed from one hand to another until all the value had been rubbed off, leaving only the grime. She did not flinch. She had built a fortress inside her own skull, a small, quiet room where she could hide. She went there now, staring at the gray board, counting the grains in the wood, and waiting for the sun to finally burn away the sky. The world outside that small room was nothing but noise and heat and the slow, agonizing passage of time. Her silence was a shield, thin as glass but all she had left. She felt their eyes on her, stripping her down to her bones, and she just stood there, breathing slow, holding on to that splintered piece of wood with her gaze as if it were the last solid thing on earth. From the shadowed alley between the smithy and the saloon, Elias watched. He had watched for an hour, leaning against the rough-hewn wall, his presence as quiet and unassuming as a fence post. The wind, hot and ceaseless, tugged at the hem of his worn duster, but he remained still. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a landscape of loss that made the blistering heat of this place feel distant and insignificant. He saw the girl, woman. He could not tell her age. She was thin as a fence rail, a bundle of sticks held together by a frayed dress. He saw the way she held her head, angled down not in shame, but in a kind of profound refusal. She was refusing to meet their eyes, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her fear. He recognized that kind of stillness. It was the stillness of a trapped animal that has given up on escape but not on survival. The crowd shifted and muttered. A woman in a severe bonnet whispered to her husband, her words sharp and pointed, lost to the wind but their meaning clear in the curl of her lip. Elias's gaze moved from the woman tied to the post to the man trying to sell her. Jedediah, a man whose pride was a bloated thing, always needing to be fed. He was a taker, a man who saw people as tools or obstacles. Elias had known men like him his whole life. They left a trail of broken things behind them. Jedediah shouted again, his voice cracking with frustration. $1. Someone give me $1 and take her off my hands. Good for chores, at least. His words were a fresh lash against the woman's dignity. She didn't move, her focus seemingly unbreakable. Elias pushed himself off the wall. The motion was slow, deliberate. He felt the grit of the dust under the worn soles of his boots as he walked from the shadows into the unforgiving sunlight. He did not look at the crowd. His eyes were on the woman, on the raw, red lines around her wrists. He remembered another pair of hands, frail and pale in a sickbed, and a pain, dull and familiar, twisted in his gut. He stopped a few feet from Jedediah. The bigger man puffed out his chest, smelling a potential customer. Ah, a man of sense. Strong back, this one. Quiet too. You'll have no trouble from her. Elias didn't acknowledge the sales pitch. His gaze flickered from Jedediah's smug face to the woman's bowed head. He reached into the pocket of his trousers and pulled out a few heavy coins, dulled with age. He didn't count them. He just held them out. "I'll take her," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, a sound that seemed to come from under floorboards. It was not a bargain. It was a statement. Jedediah's eyes widened at the sight of the coins, more than he had asked for. Greed won out over pride. He snatched the money from Elias's palm. "She's yours, then. Good riddance." Elias paid him no mind. He walked past Jedediah and stood before the post. The woman did not look up. He could see the slight tremor in her shoulders, the only sign she was even aware of the transaction. He pulled a small, worn pocket knife from his duster. The click of the blade opening was loud in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the square. He reached out, his hand steady, and sawed at the thick rope around her wrists. He was careful not to let the knife or his fingers touch her skin. The fibers gave way with a series of dull snaps. The first rope fell away, leaving a bruised, raw circle on her arm. He moved to the other. When it was cut, her hands dropped to her sides, limp and useless. She remained motionless, her head still bowed. She did not look at him. She did not look at anyone. She was free, but the invisible tethers remained. Elias folded his knife and slipped it back into his pocket. He turned, his back to her for a moment, and faced the silent, watching crowd. His expression was unreadable, his face a mask carved from weathered wood. Without a word, he began to walk away, his steps even and unhurried, heading toward the edge of town where the open, empty land began. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He simply created a space for her to walk into, a path leading away from the post. For a long moment, she did not move. The dust swirled around her ankles. Then, slow as a sunrise, she lifted her head. Her eyes, shadowed and wary, found his retreating back. It was a straight, solid line against the shimmering heat. She took a breath, a shallow, painful thing, and then, one foot after the other, she began to follow. The journey was a silent one. The town fell away behind them, its sounds swallowed by the vast, open silence of the plains. The only noises were the scuff of his boots, the soft, near-soundless tread of her bare feet, and the sighing of the wind as it combed through the dry grass. Dust lifted behind them like pale ghosts. Elias walked at a slow, steady pace, never turning to check on her. But she knew he was aware of her. He was aware of the way she limped slightly, favoring one foot. He was aware of the rhythm of her breathing when the path steepened. He set a pace a wounded thing could follow. The sun beat down, a physical weight on their shoulders. She kept her eyes on the ground a few feet ahead of her, watching the cracked earth slide by. The world had shrunk to the space between them, a distance of about 10 feet that he never let grow or shorten. It was a strange, unspoken courtesy, a recognition of her fear. After an hour, he stopped beside a gnarled, skeletal tree that offered a sliver of shade. He unhooked a canteen from his belt. Without looking at her, he uncapped it and set it on the ground between them before turning to gaze out at the horizon. It was an offering, not a command. She hesitated, her body tensed. Kindness was a language she no longer trusted. But thirst was a brutal master. She crept forward, her movements small and furtive, and picked up the heavy canteen. The metal was cool against her palms. She drank, the water tasting of metal and life. She drank until the sharpest edge of her thirst was blunted, then carefully capped it and set it back where he had left it. She retreated to her original distance. He picked it up, took a short swallow himself, and started walking again. Not a word was exchanged. The small act hung in the air between them, a single, clear note in a symphony of silence. They arrived as the sun began to bleed into a bruised purple and blood orange along the western rim of the world. The homestead was not much more than a scar on the land, a small, square cabin of weathered gray wood and a leaning barn. The place looked as tired as the man who lived in it. It was stark and functional, stripped of any softness, a testament to survival, not comfort. On a low hill overlooking the cabin, a single wooden cross stood stark against the fading light, a solitary guard. The sight of it sent a cold tremor through her, a memory of other losses, other graves. Elias pushed open the cabin door, which groaned in protest. He stepped inside and left it open for her. She lingered on the threshold, a ghost caught between two worlds. The inside was dark, smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and loneliness. It was a man's space, neat but barren. A rough-hewn table with two chairs, a stone hearth black with soot, a narrow cot against one wall. He moved through the small room with a familiar economy of motion. He lit a lantern, and the flame chased the deepest shadows into the corners, revealing a second cot on the opposite side of the room. It was bare, just a thin mattress on a wooden frame. Beside it, a neatly folded blanket sat on a small crate. He went to the hearth, where a pot of something sat cooling. He ladled a thick, dark stew into a wooden bowl and took a hunk of dark bread from a cloth bag. He set the bowl and the bread on the table. He did not invite her to eat. He simply placed the food there, a fact in the middle of the room. Then he took his own portion and sat in one of the two chairs, his back to her. This was the contract, she realized. Unspoken, unwritten. Here is food. Here is a place to sleep. Here you are not tied to a post. She watched him eat, the slow, rhythmic movement of his spoon to his mouth. Her stomach, a tight, painful knot, clenched at the smell of the stew. Slowly, cautiously, she shuffled into the room. The floorboards creaked under her weight. He gave no sign he had heard. She approached the table as if it were a wild animal that might bolt. Her hands trembled as she picked up the bowl. It was warm. She retreated to the far cot, the one he had clearly designated as hers, and sat on the edge. She held the bowl in her lap, the warmth seeping into her legs, a small, anchoring heat in the vast coldness of her life. She ate. The stew was simple, just meat and roots, but it was the first real food she'd had in days. Tasted like a promise of nothing more than tomorrow. When she was done, she set the empty bowl on the floor. Elias finished his meal, rose, and took his bowl to a wash basin. He did not take hers. He respected the invisible line drawn down the center of the room. He stoked the fire, adding a single log that caught and crackled, spitting embers onto the stone. Then, without a word of good night, he lay down on his own cot, pulled a thin blanket over himself, and turned his face to the wall. She sat on her cot for a long time, listening to the new sounds, the crackle of the fire, the low moan of the wind against the cabin walls, the steady, quiet breathing of the man across the room. He had not locked the door. The thought was so staggering it was almost painful. The door was not locked. She wrapped the rough blanket around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of him, of dust and wood smoke. For the first time in more nights than she could count, she lay down in a room with an unlocked door and listened to the silence, waiting for a danger that did not come. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, as quiet and steady as a slow pulse. There were no orders given, no expectations stated. Life was simply a collection of tasks that needed doing, and they did them. A language of labor grew between them. He would rise before the sun, his movements quiet in the gray pre-dawn light. He would go out to tend to his two scrawny horses and the handful of chickens that scratched a living from the hard-packed dirt. She would wake to the sound of the cabin door closing behind him. The first morning, she did nothing but sit on her cot, wrapped in the blanket, watching the light change on the floorboards. But the stillness felt wrong, a kind of debt. The next day, when he left, she rose. She found a worn broom by the hearth and swept the floor. The simple, repetitive motion was calming. She swept the dust and the tracked-in dirt out the open door, a small act of erasure. When he returned, he glanced at the clean floor, his eyes lingering for a second before he moved to the wash basin. He said nothing, but the next morning, he left a bucket of fresh water for her by the hearth. She began to claim small corners of the domestic space. She washed their bowls after meals. She learned the dips and creaks of the floorboards. She mended a tear in his worn shirt, her stitches small and neat, using thread pulled from the hem of her own ruined dress. She left the folded shirt on his cot. He wore it the next day. One afternoon, while he was out mending a fence on the far side of his property, she wandered up the low hill to the solitary grave. The wooden cross was weathered, the name carved into it long since softened and blurred by wind and rain. She could make out only a few letters. ANNA. She stood before it for a long time, a quiet communion with a ghost. The wind whipped her hair across her face. On her way back to the cabin, she spotted a single stubborn wildflower, a splash of defiant purple growing in the lee of a rock. She picked it and, after a moment's hesitation, returned to the grave and laid it at the base of the cross. Later, she saw him from the cabin window. He had stopped on his way back, standing over the grave. He stooped down, his back to her, and she saw his shoulders heave once, a sharp, sudden movement, before he straightened and continued toward the barn. He never mentioned the flower, but that evening, the stew he made had more meat in it than usual. She started to hum sometimes, a low, tuneless sound deep in her throat, as she worked. It was an unconscious act, a sound bubbling up from a place she thought had gone dry. The first time she did it, he was sharpening an axe blade by the fire. He stopped the rhythmic scrape of the stone against the steel for a beat, then continued, the sound a steady counterpoint to her hesitant melody. One evening, she tried her hand at making the bread. It came out of the small hearth oven dense and a little burned on the bottom. She placed it on the table between them, her stomach tight with anxiety. It was a failure, an offering gone wrong. He took a piece, broke it in his hands. He chewed it slowly, thoughtfully. She watched, bracing for a comment. "A little dry," he said, his voice neutral. He took another piece. A spark of something, a ghost of defiance she hadn't felt in years, flickered inside her. "You didn't complain about mine," she heard herself say. Her voice was thin, rusty from disuse. He looked up, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than sorrow or stoicism in his eyes. It was a faint glint of surprise, maybe even amusement. A corner of his mouth twitched. "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He finished his piece and then hers. He ate every last crumb of the burned loaf that had died in vain. That night, the quiet in the cabin felt different. It was no longer an absence of words, but a shared space, comfortable and worn as an old blanket. They were two solitary planets who had fallen into a strange, silent orbit around the warmth of the fire. The trust was a fragile root, pushing its way through cracked earth. It found its moment to break the surface on a night when the wind turned mean. It battered the small cabin, shrieking like a grieving woman, rattling the door in its frame and finding every crack in the walls to send in drafts of icy air. A clap of thunder, loud and sudden as a gunshot, shook the very floorboards. She woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright on her cot. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The darkness of the room was absolute, save for the faint, dying glow of the embers in the hearth. Another crash, closer this time, and a memory, sharp and jagged, tore through her. A small, locked room, a heavy door, the sound of a bolt sliding home. A cry escaped her throat, thin and sharp. "Don't lock it." The words were a ghost in the roaring dark. She heard a rustle from the other side of the room. A match scraped, and a flare of light bloomed, casting long, dancing shadows. Elias was sitting up on his cot, the lantern in his hand. His hair was mussed, and his eyes were dark with sleep, but his gaze was steady on her. He didn't speak. He just held the light, a small, unwavering sun in the heart of the storm. She was trembling, her whole body shaking with a cold that had nothing to do with the drafts. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her knuckles white. She could feel his eyes on her, not prying, just present. He was a witness to her terror. He swung his legs over the side of his cot and sat there, across the small room, for a long time. He didn't move closer. He didn't offer words of comfort. He simply shared the space with her, his quiet presence a bulwark against the storm inside and out. He held the lantern until her trembling subsided, until her breathing slowed from ragged gasps to shallow, even breaths. The storm raged on, but its power over her had been broken. The fear was still there, a coiled snake in her belly, but it was dormant. When she finally lay back down, she watched him. He placed the lantern on the floor between their cots. The flame turned low, a guardian light. Then he returned to his own bed. The next morning, the world was washed clean, the air crisp and cold. The silence at the table was deeper than usual. As he was getting ready to go outside, he paused at the door. "You hurt?" he asked, his back to her. The question was soft, barely disturbing the air. She looked at his straight, solid back. She thought about the locked rooms, the ropes, the hunger, the cold. She thought about the fortress she had built inside herself, stone by painful stone. "Yes," she whispered to his back. He stood there for a moment longer. He nodded, a small, sharp dip of his head. "Me too," he said, and then he was gone, the door closing gently behind him. She was left alone with his words, a quiet confession that stitched their two solitudes together with a single, raw thread. The piece they had built was as delicate as a spider's web, and just as easily torn. The harbinger came on a Tuesday, a day like any other. It wasn't a rider, not at first. It was just a change in the air, a tension on the horizon. Elias felt it first. He was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a part of the day's song. When he stopped mid-swing, he stood perfectly still, his head cocked, listening to something beyond the wind. She was hanging washed clothes on a line stretched between the cabin and a post. She saw him freeze and followed his gaze to the faint plume of dust rising from the track that led to the town. It was too much dust for a single rider. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. She knew, with a certainty that was cold and absolute, who it was. The past had a long memory and a hungry appetite. Elias lowered the axe slowly. His face was grim, the lines around his mouth deepening. He looked at her, and his eyes were dark with a fierce, protective light she had never seen there before. He gave a short, sharp nod toward the cabin. An order for once. "Get inside." She didn't hesitate. She ran inside, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't hide. She went to the hearth and stood there, her back to the fire, her hands clenched at her sides. The cabin, which had become a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. She could hear the sound now, the drumming of hooves growing louder, closer. The riders stopped outside, 2 of them. She heard the creak of leather, the jingle of harnesses, a low chuckle, and then a voice, the voice like grinding rocks that haunted the edges of her sleep. "Jedediah." "Elias," he called, his tone oozing a false friendliness. "I've come to collect my property. The debt ain't settled, after all." She heard Elias's steady footsteps as he walked to stand in the open doorway, blocking the entrance with his body. "She's not property, Jedediah, and she's not leaving." His voice was dangerously quiet. "Now, that ain't for you to decide," Jedediah sneered. "I have a contract, a bill of sale, you might say, that there is a stray. I'm just putting a leash back on her." From inside, she could see Jedediah on his horse, a big, confident man silhouetted against the bright sky. He looked down at Elias with open contempt. He was a man used to getting his way through brute force and bluster. He saw Elias as a sad, broken old farmer playing at being a hero. "You paid me for her keep, not for her title," Jedediah said, his voice hardening. "Now step aside before you get hurt." The air crackled. The confrontation was no longer just about her. It was about this small patch of land, this fragile piece. It was a battleground, and Elias was standing on the front line. She watched his back, the worn fabric of his shirt stretched taut across his shoulders. He was not a big man, not like Jedediah, but he stood there as if he were rooted to the very center of the earth. The silence stretched, thin and tight. Elias did not move. He did not speak. His stillness was his answer, more powerful than any threat. Jedediah's horse shifted, impatient, its hooves crunching on the hard-packed earth. "I ain't asking again, old man," Jedediah growled, swinging his leg over to dismount. His boots hit the ground with a thud of finality. He started toward the door, a smirk on his face, confident in his victory. That smirk was the thing that broke her paralysis. It was the same look of casual cruelty she had seen on the faces in the crowd, the look of a man who believed he had the right to own another person's soul. A fire, hot and clean, burned through the icy fear in her veins. This cabin was her home. This man was her something, her protector, her quiet friend, and she would not let this brute tear it all down. As Jedediah reached the doorway, she moved. She stepped out from behind Elias, placing herself at his side. Her sudden appearance made Jedediah pause, his eyes widening in surprise. She was trembling, but she met his gaze. For the first time, she looked him directly in the eye. She let him see the person he had tried to erase. "She stays," Elias repeated, his voice a low rumble. He hadn't looked at her, but she felt the shift in his posture, the solidifying of his resolve now that she stood with him. They were a united front, two broken people standing shoulder to shoulder against the world. Jedediah scoffed, recovering his swagger. "What's this? The little mouse found a tongue?" He reached for her arm. "You're coming with me." His fingers had barely brushed the sleeve of her dress when her hand came up. The sound of her palm connecting with his cheek was sharp and loud, like a whip crack in the tense silence. It was not a powerful blow, but it was so shocking, so utterly unexpected, that Jedediah stumbled back a step, his hand flying to his face. His face turned a dark, mottled red. Rage replaced his surprise. He lunged, not at her, but at Elias, seeing him as the true obstacle. But Elias was ready. He didn't raise his fists. He simply stood his ground, and as Jedediah came at him, he moved with a speed that belied his weary frame. He caught Jedediah's arm, twisted it, and used the man's own momentum to spin him around and shove him back toward his horse. It was the efficient, brutal motion of a man who knew how to handle unruly livestock. Jedediah staggered, catching himself on his horse's flank. He was breathing hard, his pride wounded more than his body. The other rider, who had been watching silently, shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. "No," she said. The word was not a whisper this time. It was clear and strong. It was the sound of a lock breaking. Both men looked at her. Her hand was steady. Her chin was up. "You will leave this place." Jedediah stared, momentarily speechless. He looked from her defiant face to Elias's unyielding calm, and something in his bluster finally broke. He saw that this was not a fight he could easily win. It was not just a man he was fighting, but a fortress, a home. The quiet judgment of the land itself seemed to be against him. He spat on the ground, a final, futile gesture of contempt. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the threat was hollow. He hauled himself back onto his horse, his movements clumsy with rage. Without another word, he wrenched the reins and galloped away, his companion following close behind, leaving only a cloud of settling dust and a ringing silence. They stood there together, she and Elias, watching until the riders were nothing more than a speck on the horizon. The dust settled back onto the earth. The wind sighed through the grass. The world was quiet again. She became aware that she was still trembling, the aftermath of the fire that had burned through her. Elias turned his head and looked at her, really looked at her. His eyes were full of a quiet, wondering pride. He reached out, his calloused, gentle hand, and for the first time he touched her. Not by accident, not with an object as a buffer, but a deliberate act. He laid his hand over hers where it rested on his arm. His touch was warm and solid, a grounding. "You didn't run," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I didn't." They went inside. He stoked the fire, and they sat at the table, the silence between them no longer empty, but full. It was filled with everything they had just faced together, with the new and startling shape of what they were becoming. He was still holding her hand. The next morning, the world felt new. The light that slanted through the cabin window seemed softer. The air tasted cleaner. The threat had passed, leaving behind not a scar, but a strange kind of clarity. Elias went out to mend the section of fence Jedediah's horse had kicked in its furious departure. He worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm, replacing the splintered rail, his movements a quiet act of reclamation. She brought him a dipper of cool water from the well. He stopped his work and took it, his eyes meeting hers over the rim. The question that had been hovering in the air between them since the day he'd cut her from the post finally found its voice. It wasn't about the fight or about Jedediah or the past. It was about the future. "I don't know your name," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple, profound admission. She looked down at the dusty ground. Name. A name was a label, a handle for others to use. The one she had been born with belonged to a ghost, a girl who had died 1,000 small deaths in locked rooms and public squares. It felt like a stranger's coat, ill-fitting and heavy with sorrow. "I don't have one," she said, and it was the truest thing she had ever spoken. The person standing here, the one who had slapped Jedediah and found her voice, was someone new, someone forged in silence and fire. Elias nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. He looked at her, at the strength that had bloomed in her face, the resilience that shone in her eyes. He seemed to be seeing her for the first time, not as a victim or a survivor, but as a person whole and complete. "Lena," he said. The name was soft yet solid. It felt like a smooth, warm stone in the palm of a hand. He didn't ask if she liked it. He offered it. A gift. A beginning. Lena. She tried the sound of it in her mind. It settled over her, not like a heavy coat, but like the worn, comfortable blanket from her cot. It was a name that belonged to this place, to this quiet life. It was hers. A small, shy smile touched her lips for the first time. "Lena," she repeated, her voice a whisper. That evening, a quiet ceremony took place. Without discussion, they both knew what needed to be done. She took the ragged, filthy dress she had arrived in, the one she had washed and kept folded in a corner. It was a relic of her old life, stiff with grime and bad memories. She held it for a moment, then walked to the hearth where the fire burned brightly. Elias stood back, watching, giving her the space for her ritual. She held the dress over the flames. It clung to her like wet paper, a final, desperate grasp from the past. Then she let it go. The fabric blackened, curled, and then caught, erupting in a sudden, bright flare of orange. They watched together as it burned, the flames consuming the dirt, the shame, the helplessness. It turned to black, weightless ash, which danced and rose with the smoke up the chimney. A funeral, a baptism. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. Weeks turned into a season. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The little cabin on the plains was no longer a place of isolated sorrow. It breathed. Laughter, quiet and rare at first, began to find a home within its walls. The house that had been haunted by the ghost of Anna began to feel haunted by the vibrant presence of Lena. One evening, they sat together on the small porch Elias had built, watching the sun set in a blaze of glory. The air was cool and carried the scent of dry earth and distant rain. Lena was humming the nameless tune that had become her constant companion. Elias was carving a small piece of wood. He had become adept at it, filling the silent hours by coaxing shapes from lifeless branches. He finished his work and held it out to her. It was a small, intricately carved bird, its wings half spread as if caught in the moment of taking flight. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth, warm wood. "You are either the kindest man I have ever met," she said softly, looking at the bird and not at him, "or the most foolish." He watched her face, illuminated in the dying light. A slow, genuine smile spread across his features, softening the harsh lines of his grief. "Can't I be both?" he asked. She smiled back, a full, real smile that reached her eyes. In the comfortable silence that followed, she leaned her head, just for a moment, against his shoulder. He did not flinch. He did not move away. He simply sat there, a solid presence beside her, as the first stars began to appear in the vast, darkening sky. The house was quiet behind them, its windows glowing with the warm light of the fire within. It was no longer a shelter. It was a home. This story, it ain't just about rescue. Redemption doesn't come on a white horse. It doesn't arrive like a thunderstorm to wash the world clean. No, sometimes it comes quiet. It shows up looking like a worn-out man with winters in his eyes, offering nothing more than a bowl of stew and an unlocked door. It's about being given the space to save yourself. It's the profound kindness of being seen not as a broken thing that needs fixing, but as a person who needs a safe place to stand while you put your own pieces back together. Elias didn't save Lena from the world. He just stood between her and the world, long enough for her to find her own feet. He didn't give her a voice. He just created a silence safe enough for her to find her own words. That's the real miracle. Not the grand gesture, but the thousand small, unspoken kindnesses that stitch a life back together with raw, sturdy thread. So here's your naming. Here is your moment to decide that the past is ash, and that the person standing in the firelight is someone new. We all have our hitching posts, the things that tether us to our pain. We all have our silent crowds that judge us. But if you are brave, if you are quiet enough to listen, you might just hear the footsteps of an unlikely kindness approaching. And if you're brave enough to follow, you might just find your way home, not to a place but to a person. You might find that the safest harbor in the whole wide, lonesome world is simply sitting on a porch at sunset, next to someone who is happy to just be there while you learn to fly.